The first and most necessary division in philosophy is that which has to do with the application of the principles, as, for example, do not lie. The second deals with the demonstrations, as, for example, how comes it that we ought not to lie? The third confirms and discriminates between these processes, as, for example, how does it come that this is a proof? For what is a proof? What is logical consequence? What contradiction? What truth? What falsehood? Therefore, the third division is necessary because of the second, and the second because of the first, while the most necessary of all, and the one in which we ought to rest, is the first. But we do the opposite, for we spend our time in the third division, and all our zeal is devoted to it, while we utterly neglect the first. Wherefore, we lie indeed, but are ready with the arguments which prove that one ought not to lie. Here in chapter 52, Epictetus is referencing a sort of technical distinction that gets made in Stoic philosophy, and it's an important one. It's a methodological distinction. You don't necessarily have to know a lot about Stoic philosophy in order to appreciate this distinction and why he's saying that one part is more important, whereas too much attention is paid to another part. So he talks about these as divisions. The Greek for that is topos, place. And so think of these as three different chapters, you might want to say, right? Or three different parts of the discipline where ethics and logic are coming together. So he says the first and most necessary part of philosophy is that which has to do with the application of the principles. The word application there is translating chresis, or use. It's not just merely applying, but it's applying in a certain way. It's how we use the principles, or the theorematon. Theoremata would be the nominative for it, that we have come to know. And so he has the example, and we're going to come back to this important example of, do not lie, right, as an imperative. So how do we actually apply that? Well, or how do we use it? We try not to lie. If we're lying, we catch ourselves and we say, wait a second, as a Stoic, I've got to avoid this, or even as a decent person, I need to avoid lying, right? So that's one part, and it gives us a set of rules or injunctions. It's not all merely imperatives, but that's a good part of it, right? And this is practical reasoning. This is sort of the culmination of it. And then we have to apply that to particular circumstances. Does this count as lying in these circumstances? Is not saying anything when I'm asked a question lying? What if I say something but I leave some parts out? Those are all within this first division. The second part, he says, deals with demonstrations, or if you like, proofs or arguments. The Greek for that is apodeixis. And this is showing somebody something. It doesn't necessarily have to mean demonstrative, deductive reasoning. It could be by way of giving examples, which would be inductive. But in any case, what it does is it provides a justification, or if somebody's asking not so much for a justification, but an explanation. Why is this the way it is? And so he says, for example, how comes it that we ought not to lie? What is the cause? Why is it important that we don't lie? And here it might be the whole range of, considering priorities and weighing goods against each other and thinking about, well, what does a lie do to me? And so that's all very important as well. And then he said the third part confirms and discriminates between these processes. And here we get more abstract. We're getting further away from the phenomenon itself, the key matter that we're talking about. So what's an example of that? It asks, well, how does it come that this is a proof? For what is a proof? What is logical consequence? What contradiction? What truth? What falsehood? And this is now within the realm of what the Stoics called logic, right? So Epictetus is trying to make the point that when it comes to ethics, What's really important is the first and the second. But the first is the most important because that's where the proverbial rubber hits the road, right? Your tires actually have to get some traction on something. That's where we run into real cases. That's where we either win or lose by making the right choices or making the wrong choices. Or, if we make the wrong choices, do we catch ourselves? Do we correct ourselves? Do we admit our faults? Move on? Or do we try to deny it? And so, what does he tell us further about this? He says, the third division is necessary, but why is it necessary? It's necessary because of the second division. We want to try to prove something, right? We want to prove that we shouldn't lie, or that lying is universally wrong, or pick however else you want to come up with this, thinking about why it affects the kind of person that we are. The third is about more abstract, logical principles. And it does have a lot of implications for practical reasoning, but it's not itself practical reasoning, is it? It's theoretical reasoning. And so the third part is necessary on account of the second part, so that when we go about providing arguments, we don't make bad arguments, or we're not taken in by other people making bad arguments. There's a lot of ways of stringing things together that turn out to be insupportable arguments. So studying logic really can be quite useful. As a matter of fact, it's something that the Stoics thought was necessary, and Epictetus in his own classes, not in the discourses that we have or in the Enchiridion, but we know that he taught logic in his Stoic school. So the third is important because of the second, or it's necessary because of that. And he says the second is necessary because of the first, right? Why is it laid out that way? Well, because that's where things actually happen in using the principles that are coming to us in this first. So it's very important to get this first part right, because it feeds back into the second and feeds back into the third. Likewise, it's important to get the third right, because that feeds into the second, and it's important to get the second right, because that feeds into the first. We can inherit a lot of cultural prohibitions and imperatives that turn out to be baseless when we examine them and we ask for proof. And so perhaps the second is kind of a gatekeeper, or kind of a control on the first, right? And likewise the third. So they all have an important role. But when we're thinking about our lives and about where we actually do things that are going to count, it's with respect to the first. So where's the problem then? Well, he says, the first is the most necessary of all, and the one in which we ought to rest. That's where we ought to be placing most of our focus. That's where we ought to be spending our time to see whether we're getting it actually right or not. That's the sort of thing where if you're like keeping a notebook and writing things down about how you did during the day and measuring whether you're making progress or not, it's going to be in line with this first part of Stoic philosophy, right? But what do we do instead? And this applies not just to academic philosophers, this also applies to people who want to be, you might say, dilettantes when it comes to Stoic philosophy, amateurs, people who are just kind of, puttering around with it. He says, we spend our time, we do the opposite. We spend our time in the third division, and all our zeal, all of our attention, all of our work ends up getting spent on that. We utterly neglect the first. This is a major problem. Remember, the third is important because of the second is important because of the first, and they all sort of, feed into each other, reinforce each other. If all we're doing is focusing on these important questions, like the ones that he just said, what is proof? What is logical consequence? What is contradiction? What is truth? What is falsehood? These are important, but if that's all we're focusing on, and we neglect the other parts, we're going to manage things badly when it comes to our practical lives. And the practical has a precedence for Stoics over the purely theoretical. The reason why we want to get all this theoretical stuff right is so that we can change our life towards the better and fulfill our duties and have our faculty of choice in accordance with nature. And we can add all these other things that Stoicism is fundamentally about. Now, this, like I said, this is something that academic philosophers do quite often. Simply because somebody can teach about Stoicism doesn't mean that they actually follow it or do anything that's supposed to be like it. Although presumably they would probably not be as good in explaining it in certain respects. There's a lot of academic philosophers who never bother with the practical. They spend all of their time dealing with the theoretical, what we would call the logical and epistemological, and they never end up getting around to making sense out of the murky business of their life, and there's kind of a disconnect there. There's a lot of ordinary people who do this as well, and this is something that I think can be quite dangerous for people who are engaging in self-education via the internet, which is a laudable thing. I'm not knocking it in any way, but there can often be too great an emphasis on, have you met these standards of proof? What really counts as proof? What if people disagree about this, or all these epistemological and logical issues that are real issues, but sometimes end up distracting from actually putting things into practice. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that from the Stoic perspective, we're not totally rational. And, even when we make progress, what we're doing is we're taking the rational faculty and using it to improve itself so it's more rational. But it's not like we have a perfectly, fully functioning rationality that can just, get the stuff right at the third part, and then it cascades down to the first part, which is where action happens. Acting, choosing, experiencing, reflecting on that ends up informing the other parts as well. I mean, how did the Stoics end up working out these other parts? It wasn't just by retiring off to the proverbial armchair and then musing about them. It was through looking at their lives and what would be necessary in order to make some progress, and then realizing, well, we do need logic over here in order to make some progress. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this is he talks about this example of lying. He says, we lie indeed, but we're ready with the arguments which prove that one ought not to lie. That is, we recognize that lying is wrong, and we even have great arguments for it, and we can trace them back, but there's a disconnect, like I said. We end up still lying. We end up still engaging in this practice of falsehood. Why is this one the example that Epictetus chooses? There are so many other things that we shouldn't do, that we can come up with ethical prohibitions against, that we could come up with demonstrations or proofs or arguments for why we ought not to do that. Why lying? That's worth considering. Lying is particularly detrimental from a Stoic perspective because every time that you lie, there's some sort of contradiction happening, some sort of conflict. You don't just lie for the sake of introducing a lie into the world, although, I suppose that is a theoretical possibility. People lie when they're trying to cover something up, either in relation to other people and what they think, or in relation to themselves. And if we recognize, for example, that we shouldn't lie to ourselves about the progress that we're making, but we do lie to ourselves, we're going to have some difficulties arise. In other places, Epictetus talks, for example, about the fact that there's some things that people will willingly admit to doing wrong, and then there's other things that are sort of closer to their heart and more embarrassing that they don't want anyone to know about, and sometimes not even themselves. But unless you're actually willing to be honest, you can't fix the things that are wrong. You can't work on the parts of yourself that are damaged, that are atrophied, that are in a bad state. So lying is a particularly good example for him to use in this. Our emphasis, like he's saying here, especially if we're trying to improve our lives, has to be on this first part of philosophy, and the other parts have to find their necessity, their reason for being in that first part, in the use of its principles. Upon every occasion, we ought to have the following thoughts at our command. Lead thou me on, O Zeus and destiny, to that goal long ago to me assigned. I'll follow and not falter. If my will prove weak and craven, still I'll follow on. Whoso has rightly with necessity complied, we count him wise and skilled in things divine. Well, O Credo, if so it is pleasing to the gods, so let it be. Anytus and Miletus can kill me, but they cannot hurt me. Epictetus's Enchiridion ends in a particularly apt way with some thoughts that he says that we ought to have at our command, that we ought to have available to us, that we can bring out when they're helpful. And I would suggest that these aren't the only ones. These are ones that Epictetus recommends, but they're a bit distanced from us in time and culture, so they might not be perfectly applicable for us. But Epictetus's works themselves and the works of other Stoics are chock full of plenty of other dogmata, that is, these thoughts that we can have handy when we're dealing with difficulties, when we want to keep ourselves on track. Now, this is not how Epictetus ends the Enchiridion. This is how the person who arranged all of these, his disciple Arius, arranged them. But it is sort of a definitive statement by Epictetus. He's endorsing these. And notice where these are coming from. The first one is from Cleanthes, this great Stoic figure, the second scholarch. Another is by a play by Euripides. It's kind of a nice line that illustrates Stoic principles. And then he's taking things from Plato's works, which are about Socrates and are showing us Socrates in his character. So the first one, he says, that we ought to think about, runs like this. Lead me on, O Zeus and destiny, to that goal long ago to me assigned. I'll follow and not falter. If my will prove weak and craven, still I'll follow on. That's a beautiful sentiment. And I do want to mention that, reading through it in the Greek, the translation is a little bit loose at points, particularly the last two verses. Hopoi polthumin, hos hepsomai oknos, right? So I'm going to follow, and then he says, ein dige me thelo, even if I don't want to, even if I don't choose to, right? This is recognizing that we can sometimes have what we might almost call a split faculty of choice, a bifurcated will, if you like, that we're not always 100% committed. So then he says, kakos genomenos, becoming bad, right? I'm becoming, what I shouldn't be. Still, uden hechon hepsomai, still, I won't any less follow. So, once we've decided that we're going to put these principles into practice, even if we find ourselves lagging behind, even if we find ourselves, falling down on the job, even if we find ourselves in moral failure, we can still continue to follow. We have to pick ourselves up, of course, and then continue on. And doing that will eventually produce a will that won't fall away. So that's the first one. The second one from Euripides, whoso has rightly with necessity complied, we count him wise and skilled in things divine. Wise, sophos, the person who really is the wise person, and skilled in things divine, knowledgeable about whatever is most transcendent. If divine bothers you because of the theological interpretation of it, then think about whatever matters most that person is skilled within. And the third one and the fourth one are both from things that Socrates is saying. So the background of the Credo one is Credo was a friend of Socrates. And when Socrates has been condemned to death, Credo manages to bribe the guards. And Credo's rich, right? And he comes up with arguments for Socrates. You need to leave, and here's why. And Socrates says, well, let's consider those arguments. I'm not quite sure if I should leave. Socrates viewed his engaging in philosophy as a divine mission, as something that was assigned to him, as his role, as what he was meant to do by the gods, or by the god, specifically Apollo, because there's a whole story about the oracle. And so he ends up saying, well, O Credo, if so it is pleasing to the gods, so let it be. If something really is pleasing to the gods, then that's what we're going to do. How do you figure out what is pleasing to the gods? For Socrates, it's not by going to the oracle so much, although his friend does that, kind of joking around, and then gets this whole ball rolling. It's rather that the gods are rational, and the gods want us to do what reason, rightly governed reason, rightly developed reason, bids us to do. So if Socrates comes up with arguments for why he should stay and face execution, then he takes that as being what the gods want him to do. For the Stoics, it's very important to follow reason where it leads. The last one is from his trial. The apology. Apology means defense speech. And Socrates has been brought to trial by these two guys, Anytus and Miletus. Miletus talks during, and Anytus is in another dialogue, the Meno. And they are charging him with various crimes. Corruption of the young, impiety. These were capital crimes. So they are threatening him by use of the law court with the death penalty. And notice what Socrates says. Anytus and Miletus can kill me, but they cannot hurt me. They cannot harm me. They cannot damage me. Why should we remind ourselves of that? Because when we face situations where people are doing things that we feel are hurtful, we should ask ourselves, are they hurting our reputation but not myself? Are they hurting my body but not myself? Are they hurting my possessions but not myself? And here somebody might say, wait, they're hurting my feelings, or they're offending against the rationality that I know. Well, they can't really, according to the Stoics, hurt your feelings unless you are already desiring them to see you in a certain way, or averse to them seeing you in a certain way, or talking to you in a certain way. If what they do doesn't really matter to you as good or bad, because it's up to them, it's not up to us, they can't hurt you. All they can do is take away their affection, take away the honor that you're being given, take away your possessions, take away perhaps even your bodily existence. But they cannot hurt you. They cannot coerce the core that is your faculty of choice, your rational faculty, your ruling faculty. That is free. That is unhindered if you choose it to be so. And so that is a very fitting place to end this entire commentary on this wonderful work by Epictetus, the Enchiridion.